Hello and welcome to PhysiologyZone. My name is Jack, and in this introductory tutorial to the muscular system, I'm going to provide a basic overview of muscular tissue. So we are going to cover today three key things: the function of muscle tissue, the types of muscle tissue, and the properties that they all have in common. So when we think about what muscles do, well, they can of course only do two things. They can either contract or relax. However, it's by doing this that muscles are able to produce four key functions within our body. So firstly, and pretty obviously, muscles produce body movement. And so this is everything from moving our arms and legs to running, jumping, etc. But they also allow us to stabilize our position. And they do this through continual contraction, which stabilizes the joints associated with a particular posture. So, for example, when you're sitting, the abdominal and back muscles continually contract to keep you upright. And this ability of muscle tissue allows us to sit, stand, walk, and if you want, even stand on a tightrope whilst playing a violin. However, muscles are able to perform functions beyond just movement or maintaining a position. They play a vital role in storing and moving substances around our body. And examples of this include the heart, which pumps blood around our body, the bladder, which stores and removes urine from our body, and the calf muscles, which when we stand or walk, they contract and squeeze the deep veins in our legs. And this process effectively pushes more blood back towards the heart, which increases our cardiac return. And in physiology, this effect is known as the skeletal muscle pump. And finally, muscles play a key role in thermoregulation. So when a muscle contracts, it produces heat, a process that's called thermogenesis, and day to day this heat is used to maintain our normal body temperature. If our muscles contract more though, they produce more heat, and this is best noticed if, for instance, you go for a long run. But from a survival standpoint, if we have prolonged exposure to a cold environment, this heat-generating effect of muscle contraction allows us to maintain our body temperature within just a couple of degrees Celsius. And everyone will have experienced this process as the shivering reflex, which is that rapid and involuntary contraction and relaxation of our skeletal muscles in response to cold. So to summarize so far, the four functions of our muscles are to allow us to move, to stabilize our position, to store and move substances within our body, and to generate heat. So the next topic that we'll look at is the types of muscle tissue that we have. Now when we think of muscle, it's likely that this type of muscle would come to mind, something like a bicep or a pectoral muscle. However, there are actually three distinct types of muscle tissue. So these muscles which are on the screen are known as the skeletal muscles. Next, we have the cardiac muscle, which lines our heart. And finally, we have smooth muscle. So I'm just going to introduce smooth muscle a little more because it's more widespread in our bodies than you might actually originally think. So as an example, smooth muscle lines our esophagus, the stomach, our gallbladder, the small and large intestine. It lines the bladder, also our blood vessels, some of the small airways in the lungs called our bronchioles, and even the muscle which makes your hair stand on end and gives you goosebumps, which is called the erector pili muscle. So now that we've introduced the muscle types, let's talk about their standout features that identify each group. And we're going to start with the macroscopic features, so those that you can see with your eyes, and then move on to the microscopic features, which you would need a microscope for. So thinking about their location, you would always find that skeletal muscle is attached by tendons to bone. And tendons are thick, fibrous cords or sheets, and an example of this would be the Achilles tendon, which attaches three muscles in the back of your leg to your heel bone. So then cardiac muscle is only found in our heart, and smooth muscle, as a general rule, just lines hollow organs. So now let's think about their control. So we can control all of our skeletal muscles on our own. So for instance, we can move our arms and legs as we please, so we would say that these are under voluntary control. anything which is under voluntary control is supplied by nerves from the somatic nervous system. So somatic comes from the Greek word soma, which means body. And the somatic nervous system is one part of our peripheral nervous system. And so just very quickly to clarify, the central nervous system is all the nerves in the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system is all the nerves outside of that. So the somatic nervous system is all the nerves outside the brain and spinal cord which we have voluntary control over. So both cardiac and smooth muscle, we have no control over ourselves, so these are under involuntary control, which means that they're supplied by the autonomic nervous system, which is the automatic side of our peripheral nervous system. So just to summarize here, we have the peripheral nervous system, and it's got two branches. So one side is the somatic nervous system, which is under voluntary control, and the other side is the autonomic nervous system, which is under involuntary or is automatically controlled. And finally, for macroscopic features, is to just consider the contraction speeds. So if we can just compare these side by side, you would be able to find that skeletal muscle contracts really fast, cardiac muscle is able to contract at a moderate pace, and smooth muscle contracts at a slow pace. So now let's take up the microscopic features of these muscles, which makes them stand out from one another. And so this bit can be a little bit tricky, so we're just going to take it ever so slightly slower. So here on screen you can see 3 microscopic images. So there's one of each muscle type, and we're looking down through a microscope at what is called a longitudinal section of the muscle. So firstly, let's just take a look at skeletal muscle. The first thing to notice is that it just looks quite organised. So you can see that very regular fibre pattern that are running parallel to one another. And if you were to look at these fibres in 3D space, you would see that they're cylindrical. The second thing to notice is that there's lots of these black things, and these are the nuclei. And so in skeletal muscle, there's lots of them, and they're always on the periphery of the muscle fibres. And finally, for skeletal muscle, hopefully you can already see this, but I'm just going to draw it on screen if you can't, but that stripy appearance of skeletal muscle fibres. Now these stripes are known as striations, and so we can say that skeletal muscle is an example of striated muscle. And I'll review exactly what causes these striations later in this tutorial. So secondly, we have cardiac muscle. So if we just take a look at what that looks like, it's quite similar to skeletal muscle, so it looks quite organised, and it's got that same cylindrical set of fibres if you saw it in 3D, but the key difference initially is that these fibres are branched, and I'm just going to draw that on so you can see what I'm talking about. The second thing to notice are these structures, and these are called intercalated discs. Now, you'll only find these in cardiac muscle, and they are incredibly important for allowing cardiac muscle to contract correctly, and we'll discuss more about these in the cardiac muscle tutorial. So the next thing to notice are these, which are the nuclei. So in cardiac muscle, the fibres have a single centrally located nucleus, which has usually got quite an irregular shape, as you can see here. And finally, just like skeletal muscle, these cardiac muscle fibres have that stripy look to them, so we can say that cardiac muscle is an example of striated muscle. So finally, we have smooth muscle, and so it might be more difficult to see, but the key feature to notice is it just doesn't really look like the other two, and that's because smooth muscle is structurally quite different. The actual fibres in smooth muscle are not those cords that you see in the others, and they're not in that organised pattern, but they are in fact almond or elliptical in shape. So I'm just going to illustrate on what I'm talking about. So the smooth muscle fibres or cells, because the fibre and cells is an interchangeable term, are a little bit like eyes in the sense that they're wider in the middle and then they taper towards the edges. Now in smooth muscle, they have one central nucleus that's just like cardiac muscle, but they don't have that stripy appearance, so they are not striated muscle like skeletal and cardiac. So what I'm going to do is just leave this screen up for a second, just in case you wanted to pause to read over any of these features again. So to finish this tutorial, let's just talk about the 4 key properties that all muscles have in common that allows them to function as they do. So the first property is that of electrical excitability. So both nerves and muscles share this property in that they react to stimuli by producing electrical signals in the form of something that's called an action potential. So for illustration of what I'm talking about, let's generally look at what happens in skeletal muscle. So consider lifting a glass with the muscles that bend your elbow. So the initial stimulus for this is in the form of a thought, and that originates from your brain cells in a very specific area called your motor cortex. Now these cells create an action potential, and that is our electrical signal which passes down from your brain to your spinal cord via some nerves, and then goes from your spinal cord to the muscles which bend your arm via some other nerves. So when that electrical signal reaches the muscle, chemicals are released at the end of the nerve which act as a stimulus to cause the muscle tissue to produce its own action potential, which spreads across the entire muscle. Now this is an example of chemical stimuli creating an action potential, but there are different stimuli which muscles react to. So they react to, as we've seen here, chemicals, they react to hormones, and they even react to local changes in pH. And in the sense of cardiac muscle, the cells there are autorhythmic. So the heart has some pacemaker cells which fire action potentials at a constant rate. However, the key point is that all muscle tissues have the ability to create electrical signals in the response to a stimulus. And we'll go through the very specifics of those in the other tutorials. Secondly, and really obviously, all muscles are contractile. So once they receive that stimulus and make that electrical signal, they'll contract. Now what allows this to happen is the presence of 2 proteins that are in all muscle tissue types, which are called actin on the left and myosin on the right. And I also just want to mention at this point why skeletal and cardiac muscles are striated. Now this is because of the arrangement of these 2 proteins in the muscle fibre. So you can see above this structure, now this is called the sarcomere. Now this is the basic contractile unit which is found only in striated muscle, and that's a key point. This structure here, the sarcomere, you will not find in smooth muscle. It's only in cardiac and skeletal muscle. Now in the sarcomere there is actin, which is here, and that forms the predominant portion of what's called the light band. And then there's myosin here, which forms the predominant part of what's called the dark band. And as their names suggest, this is why you have that stripy appearance, because where you've got the light band, under the microscope it looks a bit lighter, and where you've got that dark band, under the microscope it looks a bit darker, and they alternate, so you get that stripy appearance down the microscope in striated muscle. So the next point is that all muscles have the property of extensibility. Now this is the ability of muscular tissue to stretch and even contract in a stretched position without being damaged. And in skeletal muscle, for instance, this allows us to perform dynamic movement. In cardiac muscle, this is going to allow your heart to fill with blood. And in smooth muscle, it's going to allow things like your stomach fill with food. And finally, every type of muscle has elasticity, and it's much like if you imagine stretching a rubber band, it's always going to return to its original shape. And so that's it. And so to summarize what we've gone through today, we've learned about the 4 key functions of muscles, which are to produce body movement, to stabilize our position, to store and move substances, and to generate heat. We've learned about the 3 types of muscular tissue, which are skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle. And we've learned about the 4 key properties that all muscle tissue types share, which are electrical excitability, contractility, extensibility, and elasticity.